Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan from Not Just Cute, and we are here today again to talk about the read-along book It's Okay Not to Share by Heather Shumaker. And she's here to talk with us, as well as Jamie Reimer from Hands On as We Grow. And we'll talk about section, I believe it's 4A now, right? Talking about movement and rough and tumble play and why it's necessary and how to find the right balance with it in our lives and with our kids. So we wanted to jump right in first with Jamie. We were talking off air before we started about how to find that right balance with rough play. And I should preface this, all three of us have all-boy families, so it's something very familiar, this rough and tumble play. But Jamie and I were talking a little bit. Do you mind, Jamie, sharing a little bit about how the rough and tumble play plays out at your house?
Okay. Yeah, I have three boys, and I've always actually been a huge advocate for just letting them do what they want. Not completely to that extent, but I advocate for rough and tumble play. I always kind of put limits on it, though, in the past, because I feel like I was never supposed to let them be doing that. They shouldn't be playing that rough. And then I was in your book, Heather, and I felt like you were speaking right to me, saying, let them just do it, follow your heart kind of thing. So I let them, and I've been letting them do it for a while, but I feel like it's almost getting to the point of being out of control, and I don't know the right balance. Like if I need to set some kind of boundaries without actually setting boundaries to it. I guess that's just where I'm struggling right now.
Yeah. Well, one wonderful thing about rough and tumble play is it is a great way for the kids to be able to set their own limits. Now, sometimes their limits are going to be very clear. If one of your kids doesn't want to have their hair pulled or be punched in the face or something, then to help them be able to set that rule themselves and say, hey, no punching in the face when you play with me, and that's that child's rule. And if the other kid wants to play with them, because it's partner play, it's social play. You can't roughhouse by yourself. So the other people involved have to agree to that rule if they want to keep the game going. So that's the kind of play that can happen where the limit setting is actually the kid, it's kid to kid, peer to peer. And that's very, very healthy. Now sometimes what their ideas are not the same as what your ideas are. So if they think it's just fine to wrestle right near the fish aquarium where the lamp is going to break and all those sorts of things, I mean, you have to decide the basic rules and set your limits, because some things they won't notice. Their foot is going to crash down great granny's, precious plant. You have to know where it's okay. So it's normally your choice is timing and location. So if you are going to say, roughhousing is great. I see you guys want to roughhouse right now. Now is not the time. Now it's bath time. Or now we're going to grandma's house. Or so that say you can do this in general, but now's not the time. Or just say, in our house, it's the basement, it's outdoors, it's the living room, but not the other rooms. The bathroom is not the right room to do this. So setting timing and location limits are things you can do as an adult, and they often need that guidance.
Right.
Move this game too. But then when it comes to setting up the rules of the game, unless there's something that you feel very, very strongly, I just am guided by, is it hurting people or property? And are they all having fun? And once in a while, especially if people are starting to get grumpy, you might have to step in and say, I see that your face looks sad or scared, and make sure that they check in with each other. Are you still having fun? Are you all having fun? Are you both having fun? Because if somebody is having fun and somebody isn't, then it's no longer a game, it's a conflict, and that's different.
And I love that throughout the book you talk so much, Heather, about teaching kids to set their own limits with each other, which I love because I think it's a great life skill, but it also cuts down on the whole tattletale stress that we adults deal with, because we teach them to go to each other if they have a problem, to set the limits. I don't like this, or I don't feel good about this. But also to have that social referencing, like you were saying, look at your friend's face. Do you think she's having fun doing this? Or, calling their attention to help each other set their limits. And I also agree. I know I feel I use a lot the location boundary setting for me. As you were talking, I was realizing that's usually where I go. If I feel uncomfortable, or if we're at someone else's home, or we have people in our home and I can tell it's uncomfortable for them, just that I have a higher tolerance for craziness than maybe a lot of other people. So we'll just kind of suggest go to this room or go outside, or move the game elsewhere, which I think is a great way to set the limits that leaves them, like you said, still in charge of their type of play, just sets limits that they can work with.
Mm-hmm.
It's really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So what would you say, though, about, like with schools, you mentioned before, we have different rules at our home that we have at school, but as far as just the need for movement, the general need for movement, I loved, there was one of the readers that wrote in there that in the comment section of the write-up that as a teacher she realized there were some kids in her class who could sit still or learn, but not both at the same time. And you write a lot in that section about how kids need movement throughout the entire day, not just at this sliver of time at recess. And even recess seems to be disappearing in some schools, unfortunately. So what would you suggest, short of homeschooling or finding that perfect private school, what would you suggest for parents who see that their kids need more time or space for movement in the school day, but they're not getting that? How do you broach that tactfully?
Well, luckily, even though we're living in a time where recess is getting shorter, there's a lot of teachers who are recognizing that movement is important for learning. I think that information is actually getting out there, and so if we talk about it, it's not going to necessarily fall on deaf ears. A lot of teachers have told me how they incorporate movement into their schools. If some of them have kids pace the back of the room, others have them sit on bouncy balls. There's all kinds of things that are incorporated. During story time, sometimes they let kids move as they read. So I think that you may not find in your particular school that you have an enlightened teacher for movement, but in general, teachers are really learning a lot about how movement's important. And if your particular classroom teacher isn't one who's read up on that and is willing to try it, have them connect to a teacher who is. Try to make that peer connection so that they feel confident it's not just coming from you, but it's coming from sort of someone with credentials that they would trust. That it won't work, how am I going to incorporate it in my classroom? It can help get over that fear if they watch how another teacher does it or listen how they do it.
And for those who are teachers that are watching this, Jamie, part of the reason I invited her here on this discussion, her site is just full of activity ideas, and so many of them incorporate movement. That's one of the things that I love that you do, Jamie, is so many activities that they move, like not just fine motor but gross motor, like get it way on a larger scale out on the driveway or whatever space you have to work with. So teachers can find those resources like Jamie or other people that share how to weave in an academic objective with big body movement. And that's something I know when I was teaching first grade, and every now and then if we could get the gym and we'd weave both together, and the kids loved it because they were not just doing their schoolwork, but they were moving and having fun, and it's effective. It's a win-win for everybody, I think. Mm-hmm. And have you found, both of you, with your own kids, I know for me, the more my kids can get out and move and work out that big energy, it affects the rest of their behavior. I mean, coming back to that win-win idea that when we let kids move more, that they seem happier in a sense, and it's almost like they have to get it out at some point. Have you noticed that as well? I know I do with my boys. I think we kind of squash it thinking, oh, it's going to turn into a mess, and it's just like this volcano that's going to erupt anyway, and so we have to find a positive outlet for it in any way.
Yeah, I've noticed it. I mean, hugely. We just came off the longest winter ever here in Iowa, and we were stuck indoors for, I swear, like 4 months straight. And we were all on edge. I mean, I even needed to get outside and run. But yeah, but since we finally have spring here in May, finally, and it's totally a turnaround. It's a big difference. I mean, they can focus now when they are inside doing whatever else, but yeah, just getting out and running helps a ton.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that adults are often worried that movement will get out of control. And if we can find something to set a limit, for example, if you're letting them outside, make sure they know the boundaries of where it's okay to run. Your backyard, the whole neighborhood, what are your boundaries? And then let them move within those boundaries. They've done studies, and you said we have a lot of boys between us. Girls also need a ton of movement, but they have studied that boys actually need more movement than girls, that boys move more naturally than girls, and that at around age 7 or 8, is the peak of movement for boys. And think about that. That's right when we're telling them to go into school and sit down and stop moving. So the time when their bodies are being driven biologically to move the absolute most is the time we're trying to tell them to sit down. So if we just think that the messages they're getting is to move, and that they also need to manipulate things with their hands, not just running, but in order to learn, they need to move objects in space and manipulate things. So there's a lot of movement involved, and the more we can understand what their body's driving them to do, the more we can accommodate that, not really accommodate, but find ways that they can do what they're meant to be doing.
Well, and I think that speaks to another point that you made in the book, that often we take normal behavior, which you just described. These boys are driven biologically to move more and to manipulate things, which we often label with negative things like fidgeting or not paying attention or whatever label we put on it. Yeah. And you mentioned that in the book, that sometimes we label as bad behavior what is actually normal behavior, or by that same token that we set expectations that aren't appropriate, either because we're not aware of the type of things you just explained, their needs, or because we're feeling pressure from whatever social factors we're feeling we need to live up to. And with those inappropriate expectations, we create the problem ourselves by having wrong expectations rather than just working with their natural biological drives.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you hit on a couple of things there. One of them is roughhousing itself. I mean, in my book, I talk a lot about the glories of play and how much child-directed play really meets their needs and teaches them what they need. But for roughhousing and action kind of play, that's considered the holy grail of play. It's just, and it really helps with academics because it doesn't have to look like school to be helpful for school. So two kids roughhousing together, boxing, wrestling, tumbling together, that helps the frontal lobe develop. It helps memory and focus and creativity and flexibility, executive function, all those good things up there that they will need strengthened and developed for later academic success. They're not drilling the ABCs as they punch each other. They're just roughhousing and having fun. But it accidentally almost, as far as we're concerned, develops that academic. And I think just as important, it's a social and emotional development. And again, this is more for boys, but not completely. They've found that boys' friendships are, part of it needs to be physical. And so, I mean, you see that in adults high-fiving each other, but in little kids, there's this kind of tumbling around that happens, or in my brother's case, he strangled kids behind on the neck, you know? And the kids that he strangled were the ones that he liked the best, and he wanted to be friends with them. It was an overture of friendship. And so when a kid pushes somebody or shoves somebody, it's not necessarily that they're mean or violent or aggressive. It may mean, I want to play with you, I like you. And so it's so counter to what a lot of us think as adults and or as women. But some of this physical rough play is actually social and friendship building. And we need to allow that to happen, or we're hurting or damaging kids' friendships.
That is interesting. And it doesn't mean that we don't teach, like you were mentioning, sometimes those overtures may seem aggressive, and it doesn't mean we just go, oh, they're playing, but we can then teach them that social scaffolding, you know, look at your friend, are they having fun, or what, you know, maybe teach them to high five instead. But do you find, you mentioned that sometimes we read it differently as women, and I think sometimes I'll notice, you know, I'll start to feel like maybe the play's getting a little too rough, and then I kind of check in and realize my husband's a main part of this, so maybe I'm the one that just needs to back up. Have you felt that way, that you and your husband have different kind of limits on what is too rough or when it's gone too far? How does that work in your homes? I feel like my husband's sometimes one of the biggest instigators, which is great. They love it.
I actually think I'm than my husband is, or I let more go than my husband does. Because, yeah, I don't know. I can see where there's always differences.
So for you, there's a different limit, but you're the one that has a higher threshold.
I usually it depends on our moods, though, too. I guess we kind of go back and forth.
Yeah, my husband is a big roughhouser, and sometimes they get very intense with all kinds of screams and yells, and I get nervous inside of myself, and yet I wrote the book. I know the And even so, I do sometimes reach a threshold where I feel uncomfortable, and I'll say, "Are you all having fun?" And they say, "Yes!" And they're all like having a blast. And so then I just move myself. I go outside, and I ignore them because they are having a good time, and I am the one feeling uncomfortable. So instead of stopping it, I need to move myself out of the way.
That's the biggest thing I've learned so far, I guess, from this, is that I look at it as, yeah, are they having fun? And I'm trying to get that into my kids too, just for them to see, is the other person having fun? And when it's not, then it's time to stop. But yeah, that's the biggest thing that I've taken away so far. It's hard for me to be okay with it until that point, though. You know.
It can help also to set up a family code. If you do a lot of roughhousing at home, or if you're in a program, a school, come up with a school code that is a word that means everybody stop. Oh. That everybody practices that too, so that it really works. And in our home, when I was growing up, the word was simply stop. You said the word stop, everybody froze. You know, and if you said it by mistake, everybody would still freeze. But at a certain point, you need to make sure the kids have some power to get out of a situation they're not comfortable in, and it can change very quickly. So you have a tickle fest. Suddenly it's not comfortable anymore. Right. So to give a certain signal, and they can make it up themselves, it's to protect them. So they may come up with a really silly word or a silly action, and then that can give a signal that everybody stops.
It's a good idea.
That is smart. Really smart. And I think I'm pretty sure you've mentioned it. I know it definitely dovetails. I'm sure you're familiar with it, Heather. Stu Brown's work on play, and he talks so much. Well, even the beginning of his work came from studying actually criminals, people who have been violent, and realizing that their play histories were deficient. And I think it's interesting, as I was reading your book, about how we worry that this rough type of play will create violent kids. And his work shows the opposite, that when we're deficit in play, and especially in these types of play, that's where kids, well, not kids, but as they turn into adults, they're deficient in what they needed to develop, just like you're saying. And that the rough play, in particular, is a way that kids learn more self-control. It is probably a separate study, but that they learn more self-control because they're moving with these big hard movements but not hurting. They're very intentional about not hurting each other, and that requires more self-control than if they just sat quietly side by side without touching each other. Is that something that you've read more extensively on that you could expand on?
Well, it's tremendous development of impulse control because it's a game, and as long as we continue to remind ourselves it's partner play, it's social play, and it's a game, well, then they have to be able to read the emotion of their partner and watch how they react with every little movement, because if someone's not having fun, they know the game will end. But if they want to continue the game because it's a lot of fun, then they have to react and control how hard they hit and everything else to make it go on. So yeah.
I think that's a great perspective change for people who worry that this type of play, I think sometimes we look at it and we see it as this big impulse fest, and when we can realize that it's actually a big practice in impulse control, we can see the value in it a little more easily. I think sometimes that's just a mind shift for some parents and teachers that can be helpful to realize that it's practicing impulse control. It's not the other way around where they're loosening it, but that they're strengthening that through that type of play. The last thing that I wanted to make sure to talk about, I thought a great point that you brought up was when the type or the theme of the play tends to get maybe more violent, and I'm not sure that's even the right word, but a phrase that you used that I loved, you said that sometimes what we need to examine is whether or not we need to cut back on the screen time or what types of things they're watching, rather than cutting back on their play or their type of play. That we need to be more careful about what the input is and less about what the output is. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. Because a lot of kids who like this active rough play also come up with sort of active rough play ideas or themes. Kids play whatever they need to play. So if they're coming up with explosions and all kinds of games that involve some violence, they need to get that out for whatever reason. It could be combating a fear. It could be the need to feel powerful. It could be that they're replaying a movie they saw that they really enjoyed. They have some reason that they're playing it. but it's the most beneficial and creative when that kind of play is their own ideas. So if we give them a lot of screen time showing, and young kids see a lot of things that are meant for much older people. So if kids are seeing a lot of screen time that are giving them these ideas, it's probably less helpful. What their play ideas are better for their own brain development and their own emotional development if it's their own ideas. The screen time has a lot of reasons why we need to curtail it, and some of it is that it's putting other people's ideas in their heads. And at young ages, that can really not be appropriate. And others, if you're watching a screen, you're not moving. So we're talking about movement.
Yeah. I love that. Again, just it's a shift in perspective again, that like you've said over and over and over, their play is not wrong. If we're seeing something that concerns us, we need to talk about limits, or we need to talk about what kind of input they're getting that they're needing to work out through their play. And I think that's something that speaks to me anyway, that you know, maybe we need to look more about what the input is and not be so concerned about trying to control the output that plays itself out in their play. I think is really helpful. Well, I appreciate both of you coming to chat about this section. I thought it was really fascinating. In fact, this is just the first half of section 4, and the second half we'll talk about in a few weeks. In fact, the post comes up tomorrow with the summary review, and then we'll have another chat like this. But this whole topic of kids and their play and their how active they are with it, and their themes that sometimes we're uncomfortable with as adults, and why it's actually beneficial for them, I think is a message that's really important for parents and teachers to be aware of. So thank you so much, Heather, for sharing that with us and for talking with us today. It's always so exciting to be able to talk with you, and I love, like I've said before, I love being able to read this book and mark, oh, let me ask Heather about this, and let's talk to Heather about this. You know, how often do we get to actually bring up those questions? So thank you also, Jamie, for joining us. And again, I would encourage everyone to go to her website, Hands On As We Grow. It's a great resource for great learning activities, but especially as we've been talking about incorporating movement. She's just great at doing that. So I'd encourage you to head there and check that out. But thanks again for joining us for this Hangout session, talking again about It's Okay Not to Share by Heather Shumaker. You can go back to the beginning, or you can start right where we are. It's one of the brilliant things she added is she wrote this, that each chapter can stand independently. So we'd love to have you join us in this read along. It's a great resource, again, like I said, for parents and teachers. So thank you both, Jamie and Heather, for joining us, and thank you for watching. And please continue reading and adding your own questions and comments in the comment section. And I'm Amanda Morgan again from Not Just Cute, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.